Hello, and welcome to Grand Dukes of the West, Supplemental 10, the Hanseatic League. If I were to propose a central thesis for all of history, it would be this: things change over time. Now, while I wait for the plaudits and book deals to come in, your reaction might be something along the lines of "Dodoy." This is not exactly a new idea, and many of you are likely familiar with the phrase, "the past is a foreign country." One of my college professors even thought that this phrase did not go far enough, and claimed that rather than a foreign country, the past was a whole other planet. But even though we all know that things were different in the past, it's easy to forget it, or at least simply not think about it at times. I'll admit that I'm often guilty of this, and it's especially easy to forget when you're dealing with the narrative events style of history. For example, let's take my use of the term Burgundian state. I've used it here and there to avoid saying the clunkier Burgundian patchwork of territories or Burgundian personal union, but really the idea of a Burgundian state at this point is anachronistic. Without getting into an episode-long digression, as there likely will be time for that in a future episode, there is a lot of debate as to whether Burgundy could be described as a state, and the current academic consensus leans towards no. So when I use the term Burgundian state, I'm not trying to weigh on the academic debate. It's more used out of convenience and maybe a little bit of laziness. But even with all that being said, while anachronistic, the term Burgundian state isn't necessarily unwarranted, as the Burgundian Union does fit into some definitions of what a state is. I bring this all up not to self-flagellate over my use of the term, but to point out that many of the underlying things which we take for granted today aren't necessarily applicable in the past. With few exceptions, we all live in states and have spent our whole lives within a state-dominated society. But states were not always the norm, and in the Middle Ages, a whole host of non-state-like organizations existed, which could go toe-to-toe with the states and proto-states of the day. Now, non-state actors certainly still exist today, and with the direction things seem to be heading will likely only get more powerful, but I feel myself about to start another digression, so hey, the Hanseatic League, what is it? If this is your first exposure to the Hanseatic League, you might have been able to gather from my rambling that the Hansa was not a state. But that doesn't really answer the question, what is it? A concise answer would be something along the lines of, the Hanseatic League was a collection of North German merchants, merchant towns, and merchant guilds, which worked together for mutual defense and mutual profit in the Middle Ages and early modern period. A less concise answer would be the rest of this episode. The Hanseatic League, or Hansa if you prefer, doesn't really have a clear beginning, and as a league of cities, guilds, and individuals, there's not really a single narrative to follow. But we do have to start somewhere, so out of convenience, and with some precedent, let's begin with the founding of the city of Lubeck. Lubeck sits right where the Jutland Peninsula meets Germany's northern Baltic coast. The area had been occupied throughout human history, and as German eastward expansion began, the old city began to fill up with German merchants. Old Lubeck gradually grew more German, but it was still a Slavic town. However, in the mid-12th century, the old city was razed during a conflict between two Slavic groups, and once the dust settled, both of those groups ended up losing out, as the German Dukes of Saxony gained overlordship of the Wendish region. As the site was a good strategic one, a new city would be founded a few years later by the Count of Holstein, and from here on out, Lubeck would be a German city. The town soon became a key link in the local herring and salt trades, and while Lubeck was a regional trading hub rather than a commercial powerhouse at this point, it soon attracted the attention of Henry the Lion, the Duke of Saxony. Henry coveted Lubeck, and after trying to found his own city to rival it, which proved futile, he forced the Count of Holstein to hand the city over to him. This would prove beneficial for Lubeck, as Henry the Lion was keen to profit from his acquisition of the city. To this end, the Duke of Saxony worked to ruthlessly pacify the region so that Lubeck's trade could grow unhampered. But more consequential was his trade deal with the island of Gotland. Gotland sits right in the middle of the Baltic Sea, and consequently the island was at the center of much Baltic trade. Through Henry the Lion's mediation, merchants from Lubeck, as well as other Wendish and Saxon towns, were able to set up shop in Gotland, and from there reach further into the Baltic, and even into Russia. As time went on, more German merchants began to settle in Gotland, either temporarily or permanently, and the community of German merchants regularly visiting Gotland, and that's with a capital CGMRVG by the way, became a precursor to the Hanseatic League. The community of German merchants regularly visiting Gotland allowed those German merchants who regularly visited Gotland some degree of autonomy and self-government, and also offered them protection and mutual aid. And by forming the community, these merchants were also able to collectively bargain in order to gain more trading rights and privileges. I'm going to be referring to rights and privileges a lot this episode, so it's worth taking a moment to explore what that means. The Hanseatic rights and privileges varied from time to time and from place to place, but in general they could include the exemption from certain taxes and tolls, control over weights and measures, staple rights or exemption from a town's staple rights, the ability to trade freely with other foreign merchants as opposed to needing to buy and sell from a local middleman, the ability to sell retail, the exclusive right to sell certain goods, control or ownership of some land, buildings, or a church, access to certain law courts, the right to live under their own laws rather than local laws, and more. The 12th and 13th century saw a number of German cities popping up along the Baltic coast, and as more of these cities were founded, the German trading network in the Baltic grew, and the importance of the community in Gotland grew as well. However, a rivalry began to emerge between the German merchants of Gotland and the city of Lubeck, and by the end of the 13th century, Lubeck, rather than Gotland, emerged as the center of the German Baltic trade, and took over the community's responsibilities. However, this is really only half the story, because the Hanseatic League was not only a Baltic entity, but now, rather than following Lubeck, we need to follow Cologne. This actually takes us back into more familiar territory, as Cologne's mercantile history is intimately connected to Flanders. Where we currently are in the show's narrative, the mid-1400s, Flemish commerce is dominated by foreign merchants, with the merchants of the Hanseatic League quite prominent among them. But back in the 12th century, not only was Flemish commerce a primarily Flemish affair, but Flemish merchants dominated commerce all over the region, from England to the Rhine. However, the Flemings may have been victims of their own success, and as their grasp over trade in Northwest Europe tightened, their trading partners began to look for alternatives. To that end, in 1157, King Henry II of England granted the merchants of Cologne wide-ranging trading rights and privileges in his country. Cologne already had a strong merchant class, and this grant from England allowed them to really begin turning the tide. Before too long, Cologne was eating away at Flemish commerce rather than the other way around. As Cologne's commercial activity grew, it became the focus of a German trading network in the North Sea which tied the Rhine region and Westphalia to England, the Low Countries, Denmark, and Norway, a western counterpart to Lubeck's network which tied Saxony to the Baltic, Denmark, Sweden, and Russia. Now, these two networks, while separate to some degree, were not mutually exclusive. Merchants from Cologne and Westphalia traded as far afield as Russia, and merchants from Lubeck and the other Wendish and Saxon towns traded in England and Flanders. Over the years, as the activity of the North German merchants grew, these networks would mesh together, and it was the integration of the Baltic and North Sea networks which really began the Hanseatic League. But that integration was not necessarily a smooth process. For example, the merchants of Cologne were especially protective of their privileges in London, and they repeatedly lobbied against the attempts of the other German merchants to get the Cologne privileges expanded to cover all merchants from the Holy Roman Empire. Throughout the later 11 and 1200s, we see multiple German Hansas in London, and here the term Hansa refers to any merchant association or trading guild. And it wasn't until the 1280s that we see those associations in the city begin to unite into the German Hansa. Another contributing factor in this integration of the North Sea and Baltic Sea trading networks also came in the mid-1200s, when the cities of Lubeck and Hamburg formed a close alliance. This alliance opened a short land route which allowed goods from the Baltic to flow into the North Sea and vice versa. This transshipment over land was easier than sailing around the Jutland Peninsula, and allowed merchants to avoid paying tolls and duties to the Danish crown, which controlled the sea route. But perhaps the most important development of the 13th century was the emergence of the contours. At their most basic, the four contours of the Hanseatic League were trading outposts in the key centers of Hanseatic trade, where the Hansa merchants could live and do business. Contours existed in London, Bruges, Novgorod in Russia, and Bergen in Norway, all on the edges of the core Hanseatic trade zone. The four contours were not the only outposts of Hanseatic trade. Smaller outposts, generally known as Faktorien, existed throughout northern Europe, but the contours were the largest and the most important. Now, a contour was technically not the outpost itself, but rather a private corporation which the Hansards who wanted to trade in a town had to join. More so than buildings or offices, which were certainly a part of it, the contour was the collection of the Hansa merchants themselves. Each contour developed in its own way, but they all served the same purpose: to protect the Hansa merchants and their privileges when abroad. As with the community of German merchants regularly visiting Gotland, the contours allowed the Hansards to bargain collectively for privileges, and they would need to do this regularly. Whenever a new ruler came to power, the Hansa privileges would have to be renewed, and by coming to that new ruler united, the Hansards could more easily retain their rights. And when the occasional ruler decided that they wanted to renege on those privileges, the Hansards could also respond collectively. As the Hansa trade grew, the merchants became not only responsible for a sizable portion of the economic activity of the host towns of their contours, but they also generally became major food importers. Therefore, if the Hansa declared a blockade of a town as negotiations over privileges stalled, the rulers had every incentive to make sure that trade resumed at once to avoid a potential famine. The contours, with the exception of Bruges, were all walled off from the rest of the cities they were in. This both provided the aforementioned security and also allowed the contour as an organization to keep an eye on its members. By concentrating the Hansa trade into a single physical location, individual Hansards would find it harder to violate any rules placed on the organization which might threaten those valuable Hansa privileges. The contour outposts were large. Hundreds or even thousands of merchants might call a contour home at any given time, and as the merchants who traveled abroad were primarily young men, it was always important to make sure that the Hansards did not make trouble for their hosts. Moreover, this concentration also made it possible to regulate what and how much each individual merchant traded, thus reducing competition between the Hansa merchants. Through this regulation, the Hansards were able to prevent a handful of the richest merchants from crowding the rest of them out of the market, and thus made sure that they could all profit. The system of Faktorien and contours also allowed for more efficient and higher volume trading through established networks of trust. As the Hansa network developed, it became common for a senior merchant to remain in his hometown while he sent his sons, nephews, or apprentices abroad. This gave the senior merchant access to trustworthy and up-to-date information on key markets. If there was a shortage of timber in Bruges, or an excess of salt in Bergen, a merchant in Lubeck would be aware of those market conditions, and could move his products around accordingly. And this information network was not purely confined to family. The structures of Hanseatic trade encouraged merchants to build relationships with each other, be it among neighbors, friends of friends, or even people met while living abroad at a contour. These personal relationships between the Hansa merchants were a major contributor to the eventual dominance of those merchants in the North and Baltic Sea trade. Really, only the Italians had similar access to information, but with the notable difference that the Italian companies tended to be much more hierarchical than the Hanseatic networks. So, to sum up, throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, previously separate networks of German trade in the North and Baltic Seas began to merge and unite. As a part of this process, contours and other permanent outposts were established at the corners of the maritime region, which served as entrepôts to the rest of Europe. Another key part of the process was the building up of networks of communication throughout the Hanseatic zone, which gave the Hansa merchants access to lines of credit, important market information, and business partners. At this point, the Hansa was primarily an organization of merchants, rather than one of cities. The North German cities certainly were involved to an extent, such as in the initial stages of negotiating trade privileges, but we shouldn't overstate their institutional importance. The power of the Hanseatic League came from the merchants rather than the cities, and it was the collective actions of those merchants which shaped the early history of the Hansa. However, sometime around the mid-1200s, this began to change, and the Hanseatic League began to shift from an organization of merchants to one of cities. Several town leagues were forming in the Holy Roman Empire around this time, largely as a result of the decline of central imperial authority, and as the towns of a region joined together, they were able to extend their reach, maintain their autonomy, and assure their security. This process began as a response to local and regional threats, and we see city leagues popping up in Westphalia, the Rhine region, Lower Saxony, and even among the newly founded Prussian towns. The most notable of these leagues for us, however, would be the League of the Wendish towns, which formed around 1265. This league, which counted Lubeck, Hamburg, Lüneburg, Kiel, Wismar, Rostock, and Stralsund among its members, was the culmination of a longer tradition of bilateral and multilateral treaties between these cities. Treaties and alliances between the Wendish towns for procuring trade privileges, for patrolling the seas against pirates, and for protection against territorial princes looking to extend their influence over the cities had existed since the beginning of the century, and the cities knew well that they could strengthen their position by acting in concert. This trend of aggregation continued as the Wendish, Saxon, and Westphalian leagues began to coordinate their actions as well. We see the first major example of this coordination in 1280, when the city leadership of Bruges attempted to rein in the privileges granted to the Hansa merchants. Resentment of the foreigners and their privileges had been growing for a while in Bruges, especially as the native Flemish share of trade shrank, and as those foreign merchants tried to skirt around the few restrictions which had been placed on their activity. Moreover, resentment of the Count of Flanders, Guy of Dampierre, had also been growing in Bruges, and these two issues came to a head when Guy tried to intervene in a dispute between the authorities of Bruges and the Hansa merchants. The Count ruled in favor of the Hansa, but the civic authorities refused to implement Guy's judgment. So, in response, the Hansa merchants decamped from Bruges, and, with Guy's support, moved to the town of Aardenburg. This move required unity to be effective. Bruges was the biggest market in northwest Europe, and moving to a different town really would harm the Hansard's bottom line. If a significant chunk of the Hansa merchants remained in Bruges, nothing would happen, and those who departed would be at a major competitive disadvantage. So even though the move was spearheaded by Lubeck and the Wendish towns, the decision was made with additional input from the Saxon, Westphalian, and Prussian towns. In the end, all of the town leagues assented, and the entire body of Hansards in Bruges moved to Ardenburg. The Hansards were also joined by many Spanish merchants, and after 2 years, Bruges gave in. The city not only agreed to restore all of the Hanse's previous privileges and to uphold the judgment of the Count, but also granted them the right to deal directly with other foreign merchants, as opposed to being forced to buy and sell from bourgeois middlemen. This agreement precipitated a transition in the mercantile makeup of Bruges, and going forward, the native bourgeois would no longer be merchants themselves, but brokers, hostlers, and money changers, facilitating trade rather than participating in it directly. For the Hansards, the success of their relocation demonstrated the power of their unity, and a few years later, when the King of Norway tried to rein in the Hanse privileges, the League once again took action. This time, rather than simply moving the Hanse's contour, the entire Kingdom of Norway would be blockaded. However, the city of Bremen resisted these calls and refused to suspend their trade with Norway. Bremen's intransigence did not sway the rest of the League, and in fact, the city would be kicked out of the Hanse for a few years, as the other members blockaded the kingdom anyway. This time, the Hansards would be even more successful, in part due to their role in keeping the Kingdom of Norway fed through their dominance of the grain trade. After a famine hit Norway, the Hanse not only regained their old privileges, but were also paid an indemnity and given so many additional privileges in the kingdom that they ended up having significantly more rights in Norway than Norwegian merchants did. With these victories in Norway and Flanders, the Hanseatic League entered the 14th century more organized and with more confidence than ever before. And while that confidence would be briefly set back by the ambitions and conquests of King Erik Menved of Denmark, those conquests bankrupted the kingdom, and shortly after Erik's death in 1319, Denmark began to contract, and many of the German princes and merchants who had once been Erik's vassals now gained power over his kingdom. With the Danish threat past, Hanse trade continued to grow throughout the 14th century. Even the arrival of the Black Death in the 1350s only temporarily set back the Hanse towns. And while the years immediately after the plague hit were incredibly rough ones, constant immigration replenished the town's populations, and new economic opportunities compensated for lost old ones. Moreover, just as the 13th century saw the towns begin to form into leagues and take over the leadership of the Hanse from the merchants and merchant associations, the 14th century saw the further entrenchment of the Hanse of the towns. And just as in the 13th century, conflict with Bruges would be instrumental in furthering this process along. Relations between the Hanseatic merchants and Bruges were never entirely smooth, but the market needed the merchants and the merchants needed the market, so there was always a heavy incentive for the League and the town to find a way to work together. That being said, the relocation of the Hanse merchants was not a one-time event, and in the early 1300s, the Hanseatic contour was once again moved to Ardenburg due to a dispute over the Hanse's privileges. After 2 years away and the intervention of the Count of Flanders, the Hanse merchants returned to Bruges and got their privileges reconfirmed and reiterated. Still, though, the Hanse merchants were unsatisfied, and as the 100 Years' War got going, Bruges found itself caught in the crossfire. As violence erupted and piracy rose, Bruges was no longer able to guarantee the safety of those who traveled there to trade. As more merchants found themselves harassed at sea and on the road, they began to demand compensation from Bruges, which resisted those calls. The straw that broke the camel's back came in 1351 when an English privateer seized a Hanse ship in the Svin estuary. Now, Bruges did manage to track down, capture, and execute this privateer, But, in response, King Edward III seized the property of the Hanse merchants in England. And the Hanse merchants ended up blaming Bruges rather than the English for this development, despite the fact that the privateer was executed due to the demands of those same Hanse merchants. In the aftermath of this affair, the Hanse merchants demanded more. They demanded control over the weights and measures they used, they demanded the payment of indemnities, and they demanded exemptions from taxes and tolls. Bruges did agree to grant the first demand, but this only ended up convincing the merchants to double down on the others. You might note that I've been saying Hanse merchants rather than Hanse towns, and that's because so far this dispute had generally been between the merchants at the contour of Bruges and the city of Bruges, rather than one between the city of Bruges and the Hanseatic cities. The Hanse cities were a bit more hesitant to demand so much of Bruges, as they were well aware of the indispensability of Bruges' market. But more so, they were concerned that the merchants at the contour might act against the interest of the towns, especially if they decided unilaterally on another relocation. Therefore, to both deal with the situation in Bruges and to rein in the merchants of the contour, the city of Lubeck sent out invitations to the other Hanse towns, and in 1356, the first General Assembly of the Hanse, or Hansetag, was held. The 1356 Hansetag was not the first meeting of multiple Hanse towns, but it was the most widely attended up to that point. This Hansetag was also notable as it set out a number of new rules and regulations for the contours and the League as a whole, and effectively subordinated the contours to the towns of the Hanseatic League. So going forward, while the contour of Bruges would still deal with day-to-day affairs in the city, the towns would take the lead in the brewing conflict. And so a delegation was sent to Bruges to try and sort everything out. Now, this was easier said than done, and in fact, the negotiations between the Hanse's delegation and the city of Bruges went nowhere fast. And by 1358, the decision was indeed made to relocate. However, this time, rather than Aardenburg, the contour would be moved to Dordrecht in Holland, and the entirety of the county of Flanders would be blockaded. Both Flanders and the Hanse suffered from this withdrawal, and there was a notable amount of smuggling this time around. But the majority of the Hanse did hold firm, and their dominance of the Baltic grain trade once again proved to be the decisive factor. A poor harvest in 1359, followed by a rough winter, brought the county of Flanders to its knees. The Hanse had emerged triumphant once again. The deal reached in 1360 repeated all the previous concessions to the merchants, extended those concessions to the entire county of Flanders as opposed to just Bruges, forced an indemnity on Flanders, and gave the Hanse merchants in Bruges even more rights and privileges. It should be no surprise, then, that the decades after 1360 are generally seen as the height of Hanse activity in Bruges. Fresh off this victory in Flanders, the Hanse found itself troubled by developments in Denmark. The King of Denmark, Valdemar IV Atterdag, had been rebuilding his kingdom's power, and in 1360 he retook the region of Scania from Sweden, which hosted an important Hanse outpost. Scania was only the beginning, as he also seized several other territories which he had ceded earlier in his reign, and the year after that he conquered the island of Gotland. Bit by bit, Valdemar was extending his reach and turning a key Hanseatic trading zone Danish. Less than a month after the Danish conquest of Gotland, an assembly of the Wendish, Prussian, and Pomeranian towns resolved to suspend their relations with Denmark. Now, this assembly was not a full Hansetag, but it did still mark an important development in Hanseatic history, as the assembly took the novel steps of forming alliances with the kings of Sweden and Norway, and levying a tax on its merchants to pay for the coming hostilities. But although the towns of the Hanse had prepared well, their expedition against Valdemar ended in disaster, and the towns ended up suing for peace. The tense peace was not to last, however, as Valdemar still wanted to extend his reach further, while the Hansa was still anxious to prevent that from happening. So, in 1367, a Hansetag was held in Cologne, where the entirety of the Hanseatic League now resolved to stand against Denmark. To seal this alliance and allow for better coordination, a new urban league, the Confederation of Cologne, was formed. The Confederation was notable because, in addition to the towns of the Hanseatic League, it also included the Dutch towns of the Zuiderzee in Gelders and Utrecht, as well as several towns from Holland and Zeeland. As an aside, in a past episode, I mentioned that the towns of Holland and Zeeland had once been a part of the Hanseatic League. However, that's not quite true. While the towns were a part of the Confederation of Cologne, they were never a part of the Hansa proper. The towns of the Zuiderzee were sometimes a part of the League and sometimes not, depending on the time and who you ask, so there was a Dutch element to the Hansa, and while the towns of Holland and Zeeland did occasionally work with the Hanseatic League, I wouldn't call them members per se. No definitive list of members of the Hansa exists, and some accountings do include the towns of Holland and Zeeland. But really, these towns were occasional partners of the League, and more often, rivals. But anyway, the Confederation of Cologne levied a tax on its members, organized a fleet of merchant ships turned war vessels, ordered a new blockade against Denmark, and formed new alliances with the regional princes. The Confederation, along with the King of Sweden, the Duke of Mecklenburg, and the Count of Holstein, took the fight to Denmark, and by the end of 1369, Valdemar was asking for terms. The ensuing Peace of Stralsund is often seen as marking the height of the Hansa's power. The League gained control over a number of key fortresses in the Danish Sound, considerable influence over the kingdom, compensation for losses leading up to and during the conflict, and a confirmation of the ever-important Hanseatic rights and privileges. And upon Valdemar's death a few years later, the Hansa played a pivotal role in securing the throne for his grandson, Olaf. And now continuing this episode's trend of ping-ponging between covering events in Flanders and Scandinavia, it probably should not surprise you to hear that towards the end of the 14th century, relations between Flanders and the Hansa were growing strained yet again. Over the years, the Count of Flanders and the Flemish towns tried bit by bit to roll back their concessions to the German merchants. And even in the 1370s, the Bruges Cantor was sending reports back to the Hansetag, complaining about violations to the 1360 agreement. The Cantor even considered relocating again, but a united and strong response from the Count and the towns kept the Cantor in Bruges, and showed the strength of Flanders when the county was united. But soon after, the Ghent War broke out, and that unity was shattered. Now, the previous grievances were compounded by other issues caused by the conflict. Both the communal and urban parties had seized goods from Hansa merchants, and the League's demands for restitution fell on deaf ears. The security of the all-important Svin estuary became compromised, and new taxes were being thought of to fund the war. By the time the Battle of Rosebeck occurred in 1382, hey, remember that? Most of the Hansa merchants had decamped from Bruges, and when Philip the Bold became the Count of Flanders 2 years later, the Hansa was seriously considering a new boycott of the county. Philip put an end to the Ghent War shortly after becoming Count, and both the League and the Count hoped that having a new man in charge of Flanders would ease the tensions. However, the Hansa demanded a huge indemnity as well as moral restitution, a chapel and masses dedicated to the Hansa's losses leading up to and during the Ghent War. I can't find anything to suggest that Hansa merchants were killed, so I'm pretty sure these losses were all financial, and I am a bit tickled by the Ferengian idea of a shrine mourning lost profits. Anyways, Philip and the 4 members of Flanders judged these demands to be a bit extreme, and negotiations continued over the next few years. But once again, both sides seemed to be talking past each other. Finally, in 1388, spurred on by these issues and further ticked off by Philip's monetary shenanigans, which, if you recall, were part of his strategy to build power in Brabant, the Hanseatic League resolved to relocate the Kantor to Dordrecht and blockade Flanders yet again. This time, however, the Prussian towns and the Dutch towns of the Zuiderzee, which again may or may not be part of the Hanse depending on your definition, refused to participate. But the blockade still went ahead, and once again both sides suffered economically, with the Flemings getting the worst of it. But as there was still some trade coming into Flanders, and the harvests in these years were not especially poor, Flanders was not brought to its knees as it had been during the Hanse's previous boycotts. So negotiations dragged on until 1392, and the Hanseatic League was forced to moderate their demands. They still regained all their privileges, but the amount demanded for the financial indemnity was reduced, and gone were the demands for chapels and masses. Instead, the moral restitution would consist of a formal apology from 100 leading Flemings. Relations between Flanders and the Hanse would be generally good over the next few decades, but it should be noted that the Dukes of Burgundy were more able to resist the Hanse's tactics than the previous Counts of Flanders had been, and that now the towns of Flanders were more determined than ever to prevent new privileges from being extracted, as they already judged the existing privileges to be excessive. Tensions rose and eased here and there, but it was notable that whenever possible, the Flemings tried to curtail the Hansards' privileges and refused their demands for compensation whenever complaints were lodged, while on the other hand, the Hanse merchants often tried to circumvent whatever limited restrictions were placed on their activities. The tensions between the League and the Flemings would erupt in June of 1436, when 80 Hansards were killed at Sluis. Now you might recall that June of 1436 was right before the Siege of Calais, when anti-English sentiment in Flanders was at a record high. The Hansards were targeted due to the perception that they were pro-English, and due to the fact that they had been buying and selling English cloth in Flanders, despite the prohibition on the practice, and the Flemings' economic anxiety. The Hanseatic League was understandably outraged by the massacre and immediately moved the Kantor to Antwerp in Brabant, announced a blockade of Flanders, and demanded restitution. But now, the political landscape of the Low Countries was quite different. Philip the Good was not only the ruler of Flanders, but also Brabant, Holland, and Zeeland. This might have hampered the Hanse's attempt to blockade the Flemings, except for the fact that as these actions were being taken, the Siege of Calais had gone ahead and ended in failure, and now Bruges had erupted into rebellion. Therefore, Philip the Good was happy to support the transfer of the Kantor, especially as the move to Antwerp ensured that the valuable trading post remained in Burgundian territory, and he also supported the Hanseatic blockade. Although that blockade may have played a role in sparking the bourgeois rebellion in the first place, Philip now saw that he could use it to force Bruges' submission to him. The Hanseatic blockade, combined with Sluis's blockade of the Zwin and the Duke's land blockade, did indeed force that submission, and when the city reconciled with the Duke, they also did so with the League. In exchange for the restoration of the Hanse's privileges and an indemnity, the merchants returned to Bruges. But it should be noted that some chose to stay in Antwerp anyways. However, just as the Hanseatic League reconciled with one Burgundian territory, they opened hostilities with another, Holland. Now, while I've mentioned that the cities of Holland were not on the same level of the great metropolises of Flanders, or for that matter the great cities of the Hanse, they certainly were on the rise. And in the late 14th century, they began to build a trading network of their own. This network connected Holland to the rest of the Low Countries, of course, but also to England, France, Spain, Portugal, and the Baltic, and in particular here to the Hansa cities of Prussia and Livonia. The connection between Holland and the Baltic began as a simple exchange of Dutch cloth for Baltic grain, but as the network developed, the Dutch began to expand their trade into other goods such as salt and fish, and also began to transport the goods of other merchants. This made them simultaneously a dangerous rival to the Hansa and a lucrative trading partner. In particular, the Wendish cities of the Hanseatic League saw the Dutch primarily as the former, while the Prussian and Livonian cities saw them as the latter. So, to set the scene for the coming conflict, we need to briefly explore yet another conflict between the League and Denmark. This war, which broke out in 1426, saw the Wendish towns blockade the Danish Sound, much to the chagrin of the Prussian and Livonian towns, as well as the towns of the Zuiderzee. In fact, this war would really only involve the Wendish, Saxon, and Pomeranian towns of the League. The Dutch took the war as an opportunity to gain at the Hanse's expense. They aligned themselves with Denmark and took the Hanse's place as the principal merchants of the kingdom. They also formed an operation running the blockade of the Sound, and some hired themselves out to the Danes as privateers and attacked Hanse ships directly. But after 9 years of war, the economic power of the League prevailed, and the Hansards emerged from the conflict with a number of new privileges, including control of the Sound. So, even though the blockade was now over, the Dutch would still be excluded from the key waterway. Not only did this closure threaten the Dutch economy, but it also threatened famine, as Holland was dependent on Baltic grain. So, in April of 1438, the Council of Holland declared war on the Wendish towns of the Hanse, and raised a fleet to prosecute that war. I'll admit that before I really dug into researching the Dutch-Hanseatic War, I had intended on dedicating a whole episode to it, but the fact of the matter is that not much actually happened during the war. For the most part, the conflict comprised of the Wendish towns blockading the Sound against the Dutch, and the Dutch trying to run that blockade. No sea battles took place, but piracy was rampant, and sea trade across northern Europe suffered. After a few years of conflict, the Wendish towns, under pressure from the King of Denmark and the other Hanse regions, agreed to make peace with the Dutch. When all was said and done, the Dutch regained access to the Baltic, and in exchange agreed to make a large indemnity payment to the Wendish towns. The cash influx benefited the Hanse in the short term, but in the long run, the Dutch ended up coming out ahead. That being said, the Baltic trade was not a zero-sum game, and the return of the Dutch to the Baltic was welcomed by most of the Hanse towns. The Dutch were rivals, yes, but also important trading partners. And the Dutch-Hanseatic War exposed some serious fault lines in the League. But the Hanse survived, and the League's trade continued to grow. So for now, we'll leave off with the Hanseatic League as strong as ever, but with some storm clouds approaching. The unity of the League could not be taken for granted, and rivals began to appear. We will return to the Hanse again in the 1450s, and for the rest of our story, they will remain a fixture of the North and Baltic Sea trading networks, and a vital participant in the market of Bruges. Before I go, I do feel the need to note that this episode should really not be taken as a comprehensive overview of the Hanseatic League. I felt that it was appropriate to focus on the Hanse's relationship with Bruges, but there's just so much more that I did not have the time to cover in the depth that it deserves, such as the League's relationship with Russia, the Teutonic Order, the Scandinavian kingdoms apart from Denmark, the Hanse's crusade against piracy, or how the League responded to the wave of popular uprisings in the early 15th century. The Hanse is a fascinating organization, and if you do want to learn more, as always, I'll have my sources posted on this episode's page on GrandDukesOfTheWest.com. I will shout out Brill's companion to the Hanseatic League, and Philippe Dollinger's The German Hanse as being especially useful. And if you're listening to this episode, you're probably a history podcast fan anyway, so I'll also shout out The History of the Germans miniseries on the Hanse from around 2 years ago. And we'll be horning in on Dirk's domain for a little while longer, as next time we'll be staying in the Empire as we follow the rise of the House of Habsburg. Thank you so much to my patrons: Christine, Duchesse de Nemours, Elliot, Graf von Kravenstein, Anthony, Comte de Chateauneuf-en-Auxois, Preston, Comte de Saint-Fargeau, Mark, Comte de Meursault, Diana, Graf von Beersel, Mehmet, Comte Santerre, Chris, Comte de Semur, Rosa, Comte de Germol, Elliot, Comte de Bussy-le-Grand, Eric, Comte de Couche, David, Graf von Barland, Jonathan, Comte de Bazoches, Olivier, Comte d'Ussert, John, Graf von Helmont, Spencer, Graf von Breda, Craig, Graf von Hoensbroek, and to my Knights of the Duchy. If you want to join them, you can at patreon.com/ValoisBurgundy. If you want to support the podcast in other ways, you can do so by leaving a review on your podcast app of choice and telling your friends about the show. Both really help to grow the show and will earn you my everlasting appreciation. If you want to keep up with the show, you can follow me at ValoisBurgundy on Blue Sky, or check out the podcast website for maps, images, sources, and more at GrandDukesOfTheWest.com. Once again, thank you for listening.